Frank Abagnale. I don't know if you recognize that name, but he was probably the most talented imposter of all time. During the 1960s and early 70s, between the ages of 15 to 21, he was one of the most daring con men, forgers, imposters, and escape artists in history. In his brief but notorious criminal career, he donned a pilot's uniform and co-piloted a Pan Am jet. He masqueraded as a supervising resident of a hospital. He practiced law without a license. He passed himself off as a college sociology professor, and he cashed over $2.5 million in forged checks, all before he was 21 years old. He was eventually caught by the FBI. He served some time, and then after he got out of prison, he actually worked for the FBI, training agents how to spot counterfeit money and checks. Now he has his own very successful company where he helps people with security issues. But he's now recognized as the leading authority on financial foul play. He wrote a book, an autobiographical book. They made it into a movie several years ago with Tom Hanks called Catch Me If You Can. And he was such a convincing imposter. Years after his prison time, he became known, and as he became known, he went on the game show called To Tell the Truth. Now, this is many years ago when we still had rotary phones, but this was a game show where there were three people who claimed to be the same person. And they would tell things about themselves, and then the contestants would ask them questions, the contestants trying to identify who was the real person. And so at the end of the show, after they had tried to guess, the host would then say, "Would the real Frank Abagnale please stand up?" And they would see who the real one was. Now, we're looking at the real Christmas story and how there have been imposters who have tried to hijack the real reason for Christmas. And again, we're not here saying that how we celebrate and all the trappings and everything is all that bad, but we're just saying that when it comes to our celebration of Christmas, if the celebration of Christmas becomes more important than the celebration and the worship of Christ, that's when we have a problem. So one week we looked at the real reason for Christmas, and that's because that you and I are sinful. And last week we considered the real meaning of Christmas, that God is knowable, that truth is tangible, that we are valuable to God, and our lives have meaning. But today I want us to see how the real Christmas story is a story about real families. And I'm going to go to Matthew chapter 1. And if you have a Bible, you might want to turn there. Matthew, the first book in the New Testament, is that one of the four stories of Jesus' life. And in Matthew chapter 1, he records the genealogy of Jesus. And so I want us to see how the real Christmas story is about a real family that had a history of real problems leading all the way to Mary and Joseph, whose story is anything but picture perfect and neat and tidy. It's messy, and it's just real life, and it's just how families are sometimes. Now again, I want you to turn to Matthew 1, but instead of me reading through this genealogy, I thought we could listen to it being sung. Now I want you to pay close attention, because there will be a quiz at the end of this, all right? But go ahead and let's listen to Matthew chapter 1 right now.
Abraham had Isaac he had Jacob he had Judah in his kin. Well, then Perez and Zerah came from Judah's woman Tamar. Perez he brought Hezron up, and then came Aram, then Amminadab, then Nahshon, who was then the dad of Salmon, who with Rahab fathered Boaz. Ruth she married Boaz, who had Obed, who had Jesse he had David, who we know as king. David he had Solomon by dead Uriah's wife. Solomon, well, you all know him. He had good old Rehoboam, followed by Abijah, who had Asa. Asa had Jehoshaphat, had Joram, had Uzziah, who had Jotham, then Ahaz, then Hezekiah. Followed by Manasseh, who had Amon, who was a man, who was father of a good boy named Josiah, who grandfather Jehoiakim, who caused the Babylonian captivity because he was a liar. And then he had Shealtiel, who begat Zerubbabel, who had Abiud, who had Eliakim. Eliakim had Azer, who had Zadok, who had Achim. Achim was the father of Eliab. Then he had Eliezer, who had Mathan, who had Jacob. But listen very closely, I don't want to sing this twice. Jacob was the father of Joseph, husband of Mary, mother of Christ.
Okay, you got that? Now, let's have a quiz now, right? So that was Andrew Peterson singing the song. I love Andrew Peterson. I don't know who it was writing that, but, like, how do they write so fast? This blows my mind. Well, Matthew in chapter 1, he has this long genealogy as he's writing to the Jews because he's trying to convince the Jewish people that the long-awaited Messiah had come. And what Matthew records here would have been a matter of public record. Somebody could have gone to the temple and could have verified all of these things and looked it up. But he wants to make sure that people know that Jesus has the legal right to be the Messiah. He's the only one that they had been waiting for, that he alone was the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, that the Messiah would come from the line of David. And if that genealogy isn't right, then the rest of the New Testament doesn't make any difference at all, because that's what really matters. And so even though there is a lot of interest in genealogies these days, because they're very interesting and they can find some interesting facts, back in ancient times, genealogies were so important. Taxation, land allotment, and all kinds of things could actually go back generations. So it was very important that they had these things set. And so he begins with this list of names. And I don't know about you, but usually when I'm reading in Matthew or even in Luke and I'm seeing these genealogies, we just kind of are tempted to skip right over them. But I want us to understand what some of these names represent, because there are some pretty shocking people in this genealogy. And I want to look at a couple of them, and I want to look at some of the women. Now, mostly because in ancient genealogies, women were hardly ever listed in these things. And yet here in the line of Jesus, we have some mentioned, and especially when we find out who exactly they are, it's pretty shocking. Now, if you or I were going to try to write something to convince people that Jesus is the Messiah, why would you have some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in there? Wouldn't you just leave that out? Well, you wouldn't if it was just the real story about real life, about real families, that this stuff actually happened. But there are some pretty shocking names. I want to look at one of them, and this is a lady named Tamar. Now, Tamar's story is found in Genesis 38, and it's a little bit grisly, but she is married, Tamar, to the son of Judah. Now, Judah was one of the sons of Jacob, one of the 12 tribes of Israel that became the nation of Israel. But her first husband dies. And so it was customary in that day that she was given in marriage to another of Judah's sons, but he died as well. Judah now had only one son left, and he's like, I'm not going to let my remaining only son marry her. And so he lies to Tamar and says that he's not old enough, but when he's old enough and ready, then he will marry you. Well, time went by, and she didn't hear from Judah. But one day in the marketplace, she saw Judah and his son, who was now obviously old enough to be married. And yet, Judah would not give her to him. And so she decides that she's going to be childless, which is a horrible state back in that day, that she was going to be childless unless she did something. So what she did was she dressed up like a prostitute. She propositioned Judah, only he didn't know it was her because she had this veil on. And he said that he would like to enlist her services, but he didn't have any money. And so she demanded collateral. So he gave her his robe and his staff, and they slept together. Now, Tamar became pregnant with Judah's child. And eventually Judah saw her. And he became so outraged that his daughter-in-law would be pregnant. And he called for her to be stoned and demanded to know who the father was. And Tamar said, well, the father is the one to whom this staff and this robe belong. And he recognized that he was the one who got her pregnant. What a story, right? Merry Christmas, right? She's dressed up like a prostitute. She's desperate. And yet here's the thing. God has grace on the desperate. And even Tamar, she became a descendant of Jesus Christ. There's another name on there, and her name is Rahab. Now, Rahab actually was a prostitute, and yet she was used by God at a very critical time to assist Joshua as he would overtake Jericho. And there she is in the line of Jesus Christ. And you go a little bit further, and you read about another lady named Bathsheba. Now, Matthew, in chapter 1 of Matthew, he doesn't use her name. He doesn't have the name Bathsheba. But look what it says in verse 6 of Matthew 1. It says that David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Doesn't mention her by name, but every Jewish person reading this would have known to what it was referring. It reminds them and us that King David committed adultery with Bathsheba, got her pregnant, then tried to cover it up by arranging to have Bathsheba's husband Uriah, one of David's main guys, killed at the front lines. And yet God has grace on those who sin against him and make mistakes. David repented, and he was given grace. And because it's not through David's wife Michal that Jesus traces his lineage, God uses people of all kinds to do his will. So we see Tamar and Rahab and Bathsheba, and you wonder again, why in the world would these names be included? Yeah, I know you're trying to establish the legal right of the Messiah to the throne of David, but why include these names? One scholar says these names are given not just to tell us who Jesus is or how he got here, but again, why he came here. They don't just give us evidence. They give us hope that he is actually the Savior of the world. You see, if we read the Bible, you'll see that there is a lot of space in the Bible. And this is just a sampling. The Bible talks a lot about the messes that people make of their lives and the bad decisions and the outright deception. There's a lot about there in that. And you can't even read some of it in public because it's embarrassing. If you thought what I told you was bad, if you're unfamiliar with the Bible. But how about you? Do you have any embarrassing branches in your family tree? Are you like the guy that I heard about? He wanted to look into his genealogy, and so he paid some genealogy service $500 to get his family history looked up. And then when he found it out, he paid that same place $1,000 to get it hushed up. Like sometimes we don't like what we see. I know my family's probably watching this, but anyway, I don't care. So I found out a couple years ago that I don't know exactly the relation. Maybe my great-great-great-great-grandfather, somebody in my bloodline, murdered a guy. Just like cold blood murdered him. And then he tried to evade the laws by fleeing to Texas. And there he was in Texas, and he killed a guy. And well, finally, they caught up with him. But he killed a guy just because this guy evidently just ticked him off. So I'm just saying, be careful. Don't tick me off because, I evidently somewhere in my gene pool, there's this stuff. I don't know. But why would Matthew include all this stuff in the lineage of Jesus? Does such scandalous stuff belong in the Bible? Well, it does. If the Bible is just telling a story about real life and real people and real places, about real things that happened, and that is what it is doing. Because it's all leading up to that one name of Jesus who would come to save people from their sins. He's introduced as Savior, and all these stories and all these names just reinforce to us what we already know, right? That we live in a broken world. That really not a whole lot has changed in the last 2,000 years. We live in a broken, messed up world, and we need a Savior to come to us and to make it right. Well, there's another name in this genealogy, and her name is Ruth. In Matthew chapter 1. Now, her story is different from Tamar or Rahab or Bathsheba because they needed God's grace and forgiveness for their mistakes and sins. But Ruth needs God's grace in a much different way. This time of year, we focus on peace and joy, and that is appropriate. But for many of you, you know that this time of year, Christmas, can be very hard and can be very lonely, and maybe can bring some pain of the past to the surface. And maybe Christmas time just hurts. And I think for all of us that we find that Christmas just brings a lot of stress and pressure, and we need grace and peace. And I think especially for those of you who may have lost a loved one, it's just really hard maybe to endure Christmas time without them. And if that's you, I want to really encourage you to come to something that we're having here at the church on Wednesday called a time or a night of remembrance. And Carol Buckner is going to lead that, and I've asked her to just come up here for just a couple minutes to share with us exactly what that night of remembrance is going to be about.
So since Chris asked me to come up and share something with you, I've been trying to come up with the right words to be able to express what we experienced as a church family 2 years ago on our first night of remembrance. And I can't quite land on it, because I think that when we experience something so powerful as a church family, it's hard to come up with anything specific. But I come back to love, because the night of remembrance is about us coming together to be able to remember the people in our life that is no longer living here on earth. And when we have a safe place to do that as a loving family in God's house, that reduces our isolation that we feel in the outside world, because grief is tough. And if we don't have that opportunity to have an outward expression, to be able to bring pictures, and we had pictures lying on the communion table to honor those people. And we shared stories, and we talked about the gifts that we received. And I want all of you to know that you are invited to invite people outside of the church to come and join us. I also really want to encourage that this is not just for women, because men, you also grieve. A lot of you don't have that outward expression because society doesn't support crying and thinking that we have emotions. And we all do. I come back to God's pain that he felt when Jesus died on the cross. How can we not, as human beings, also suffer? And so if we can come together and we can express and feel and love, and it's not just tears and sadness on that night. There was laughter, there was peace, there was comfort, and it's coming together to be able to do that. There's not a time frame on grief, and there's not a time frame on mourning. We had people, I actually think there was, if my memory serves me, we had someone that had a grandparent who had just died that morning. I also acknowledged my father, who had died 25 years previous. Larry, I'm going to put him on the spot right now. He said, I don't need to go. I'm good. My mom died 16 years ago, and, we've talked, we're good. And so he stayed down in the fellowship hall for a while, and then he decided, I'm just going to kind of go and see what's going on, see if anybody needs anything, and he joined us. And at the end of the evening, he said, I'm really glad that I was there. So if you are feeling isolated, if you need to just be able to come and to be able to share and to know that you're supported and you're not alone, please join us. If you are uncomfortable with talking in front of people, then please come and just know that you can come and sit in silence and honor that person. If you have any questions, please feel free to stop me, to talk with Dar. Dar is helping to coordinate everything, and I would encourage all of you, if you're just questioning whether you should come or not, then come. It's a beautiful night for us to be together.
And thank you so much to you and Dar for doing that. And again, I really want to encourage you to attend that. I know it will be meaningful, and it will be healing for you. But it's a stress-filled and pressure-filled time. Maybe for you, it's not the loss of a loved one. Maybe it's just the whole Christmas thing of like, for instance, shopping, right? There was a British psychologist named David Lewis, and he wrote an article, and man, you're going to love this one. He wrote an article, and you might want to write this down, that he has scientifically proven that shopping is hazardous to men's health. Now, we probably already instinctively have known this, but he has the hard evidence and the numbers. He tested men of all ages by sending them out to do Christmas shopping, and he recorded their heart rates as they went shopping. And I kid you not, this is what he discovered, that by and large, on average, the blood pressure of these men shopping during Christmas season, their blood pressure rates were what you would expect in a fighter pilot going into combat. Like seriously, right? But we all have different ways that we have to try to handle stress and pressure, and Ruth certainly understood that. We need to understand what she was dealing with. They weren't long lines at the stores, they weren't unexpected visitors, but she was experiencing pain and loss as we read about her in the book in the Old Testament that bears her name. The book of Ruth is only 4 chapters long. But the short story is it begins with a man and his wife Naomi and their 2 sons who are living in Israel. But there's a famine in the land, and so they need to do something to get food. And so the man moves his wife and 2 sons to a nearby foreign country that was actually an enemy of Israel called Moab. And he hoped to provide for his family. Well, while they were there, the sons grew up, and they found 2 Moabite women to marry. But then the father died, leaving Naomi with her 2 sons and her 2 daughters-in-law. Some more time passed, and both of the sons died. So there is Naomi in a foreign country without husbands or sons. She decided to go back to her hometown. Now, it's a small town in Israel, but she's hoping by the time that she gets back there, things will have changed. And she encourages her daughters-in-law just to stay in Moab where they had family and friends and just stay there. And one of them agrees to stay in Moab, but then there's another one, and her name is Ruth. And she says, no, I'm going to go with you. And Ruth says something to Naomi that is so beautiful. And you probably will recognize these words from Ruth chapter 1. When Ruth says to her mother-in-law, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me ever so severely, if anything but death should separate you and me. And so these 2 women have experienced incredible loss and incredible pain, but they decide that they're going to go back together and stick together. And now you probably have heard those words at wedding ceremonies. Probably every wedding I've ever done, they have been in it somehow. Where you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die. Your God will be my God. Now typically in a wedding, right, this is used to express love between the bride and the groom. But if we're going to be biblical about this, what ought to happen is at some point in the wedding, the bride should turn to her mother-in-law in the front row and say these words to her. Now, I've never seen that happen, but that's probably what should happen if we're going to be biblical about this. Because we've kind of taken this out of context, but it still communicates commitment and a deep love and devotion. And so Ruth goes with her mom-in-law back to Naomi's hometown, but they're still filled with grief and sadness and bitterness. And it says, especially of Naomi, that she was filled with bitterness about how her life had turned out. This wasn't the way it was supposed to be, losing her sons, losing her husband. And some of you, again, understand that kind of grief and maybe even bitterness about life, that somehow things just got out of whack, somehow things took a wrong turn, and it's not how it's supposed to be. And that is really, I think, what God had on his heart when he decided that the time was right, as Galatians tells us. When the fullness of time had come, he looked down and he said, this is just not right. Something isn't right. And so I have to do something about it, and I'm going to do it right now. And so we understand that. And it's hard, especially at Christmas time. Lights are being hung, carols are being sung, gifts are being exchanged. And the subtle message at this time of year is, if you are sad or upset or whatever, just get over it. Just get some holiday cheer. Have a glass of eggnog. By the way, I just saw a study last week that the majority of people do not like eggnog. And so I thought I wanted to take my scientific survey this morning. How many of you we're talking about straight eggnog, okay? How many of you like eggnog? Raise your hand. I'm just curious. How many of you do not like it? It's about half and half, all right? You people that do not like eggnog, like, what is your problem anyway? Seriously, right? Pretend to be happy. But it's just hard. It's just hard this year. And maybe you just want it to be over so you're not constantly reminded of your loss or your grief or your problems or your illness or whatever it might be. I love that line from the classic C.S. Lewis trilogy or book series, The Chronicles of Narnia. And in those books, he describes Narnia like this. He says, it's always winter, but it's never Christmas. And maybe that's how some of you feel. You know that it's Christmas. You know that it should be a time of joy and happiness, but you're just not feeling it. It's just winter. But one of the wonders of Christmas is that there is grace for you if you find yourself in this frame of mind. And the truth is that such times will happen at Christmas at least once or twice in everybody's life. And so when they come, that is a perfect time to do what we're trying to get at with this series, is to get past all of the exterior stuff of Christmas and to recognize it for what it really is. And all the lights and the trees and the presents and the music and the parties and all that stuff, that's just like wrapping paper. It looks nice. It's pretty to look at, but it's not really what it's all about. The real gift is a humble, unassuming baby that was born in an obscure village, God in human flesh, who came to be one of us, to understand our pain, to redeem our lives, to heal and to fix our brokenness. And His grace is sufficient, even in Christmasless winters of the soul. So when Jesus was born into this world, we have God with skin on, and it changes everything, that how He knows us and how He relates to us and how we're able to relate to Him. And suddenly, when Jesus is born into the world, here's a very clear message for those of us who are hurting, that He knows what it's like. He knows the wide range of human emotions, and the Bible makes it clear that this is true of Jesus. So I don't know, maybe there's some of you here this morning and you're really, really struggling to make ends meet. There's grace with you because Jesus knows what it's like to be in that situation. He was born to parents of meager means. They didn't even have enough money to pay for the sacrifice of a lamb at His birth. They had to just sacrifice a couple doves. Maybe you're struggling because you don't have a family that loves or supports you. That is the hardest, deepest kind of hurt there is. And this time of year, maybe it just brings all of that to the surface. Jesus knows what that's like. He had a mother and brother who were ready to have Him committed when He began His ministry because they thought that He had lost His mind. Some of you have a friend who has let you down this time of year. You're reminded of that, and Jesus knows what that's like. He was betrayed by His closest friends at the worst point of His life. He was unfairly sentenced to death. There's grace in knowing that the one who travels with you knows what it's like. The Hebrew writers speaks of this gift of Christmas, that Jesus walks in our shoes and knows what it's like. When the Hebrew writer would say, we don't have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with us in our weaknesses. He knows what we're going through. So then let us approach the throne with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. He knows, He understands pain, challenges, and the suffering of this world. The other thing that we're reminded of from the story of Ruth, and I think one of the most profound things, is that God isn't finished writing this story yet. God is not finished writing the story of this world yet. And if you will allow Him, He is not finished with your story as well. Ruth and Naomi return to her hometown. They're hurting, they're suffering, they've experienced great loss, bitterness, but there they go, and they find redemption. Naomi was from a very small town. A town at that time was significant, but again, you know it. It's called Bethlehem. And so this Moabite widow comes with her mother-in-law into a small town of Bethlehem. And there she meets a man named Boaz. And the way that the Bible speaks of Boaz is it calls him Ruth's kinsman redeemer. That this was kind of a system they had back in that time, that if a man died, the next of kin could marry his widow and could assume responsibility for everything. And that was this guy named Boaz. And so they fall in love, and Ruth marries Boaz, and he loves her and he takes care of her. And together they have a son named Obed, and their son has a son named Jesse, and Jesse has a son named David. And Ruth is the great grandmother of King David. And then you follow that lineage all the way to the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, how in the world does God work that out? That this widow from a pagan country, she's not even Jewish. Now she's in the genealogy of King David and of Jesus Christ. How does God work all that together? Well, I'll be honest with you, I don't know how he does it, but I do know that he still does it. That he takes a story that seems hopeless and broken, and when we give him the pen of our life and we say, God, would you write the next chapter of my story? Would you write it with me? God does his best work. But we have to come to him. We have to humble ourselves. We have to acknowledge that he is the Lord. He's not just a tiny baby. He's the Lord. And when you call somebody your Lord, that means that he can do whatever he wants in your life. And so we listen to him and we submit to him. That's when he does his best work. And that's the invitation that we have as we ready this last week before Christmas, as we try to get our hearts ready, that in our hearts and in our minds, that we can just imagine that maybe up till now you've been writing your own story. And maybe through circumstances, maybe they're circumstances that you have caused, maybe they're not. But you have been trying to write your story, and maybe it has not been the way that God says that we ought to write our stories. At some point, you need to say, God, I want to do it your way. Here's the pen, here's the paper. Would you write the next chapter in my life? Would you write the rest of the story? And if you do that, and if you are sincere and humble, friends, he will do that. He will do that. Doesn't matter how broken things might seem. He can do that. And that's what we celebrate at Christmas.